It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulson and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Take Command podcast, Logan Paulson there in the Cape. I'm Craig Hoffman. Don't worry. He's not going to the ocean, not going to get eaten by a shark.
Well, we'll see. I'm going to do my best not to get eaten by a shark. But like you said, there's a little bit of shark activity. So just got to be smart about
If you don't go in
time.
the ocean, then you can't get eaten by a shark. They're not coming on land to get you.
That is true. Yeah, that's a good point. They haven't evolved legs yet. So, yeah. Good point.
Yet. All right, here's what we got today. We got a mailbag. Again, coming up later in the week are coach rankings for the NFC East. We'll do head coaches and then both coordinator spots for each team, who's got the best and worst coaching staff in the division. But today, it's a mailbag. We have a ton of questions. Y'all have really stepped up on the questions front. We actually already have quite a few for next week as well that we're excited about. But we're going to start with this one from Watson. Watson sent us an email, Logan, and wanted to know about the development pipeline. He says, consistently you hear that the best teams develop players. So who are the top 7 developmental prospects on Washington's roster? Thanks, Watson. First, let's define what we are going to mean by developmental prospects.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about it when you sent me this question, and I think the thing that comes to me is like guys that are going to develop into starters, like kind of irrespective of like draft position. And I think that's ultimately like what you're looking at with like the Eagles as a good example, like with Milton Williams, just as a point of comparison. Like he's a 3rd round pick that develops into a guy that, you know, is a priority free agent when he hits the market, when his contract's up. And I think that's kind of what you're looking at, something like that, someone that's going to contribute to the roster. You know, obviously Milton Williams is like maybe the extreme version of this question, but someone that's going to play starters minutes and someone that's going to like you feel good about on the roster. And so like there's guys like the first guy that comes to mind just as a starting point is like Brandon Coleman, I think is a perfect example. Like he's a guy with a ton of athletic potential, ton of upside, but he's got to figure out kind of his home on the offensive line and he's got to develop in terms of his production at guard, right? Which is a new position this year. So like he's a guy that to me feels like has an arc that gets him to a starting caliber player. And in some versions of the universe, like the multiverse, he's a kind of a Cosme-esque type player where he was an okay tackle, but he's an excellent guard because of the athleticism. And so to me, that feels like a perfect example of a developmental guy, you know, needs some time with Coach Johnson to kind of develop his skill set, hone his skill set at that guard spot. But to me, that's someone that sticks out, a guy that athletically kind of meets all the criteria. And I think ultimately settles on, you know, being a solid starter for your team, you know, hopefully this year, but maybe next year.
Yeah, I think where this question gets interesting is like, what's your threshold for being a developmental player versus like, oh no, that guy doesn't count. Was drafted too high or is too good. Because like realistically, like Josh Connerly, I mean, here's number one.
I was going to say he'd be my next person, honestly.
He's your number one because he's your 1st round pick this year, and you're hoping he develops into a starter. And even though he's got some flaws in his game, that's why you're drafted 29th, not 9th. But you know, even when you're 9th, you're got some flaws. You're a rookie in the NFL. But like, what's the threshold of quote unquote too developed or drafted too high to qualify for this question? I'll say the first guy that came to my mind was Johnny Newton. You know, they draft him. He misses his first offseason because of the foot stuff. He plays pretty well last year, but like, if they're gonna get where they want to go, they need Newton to develop into a borderline star. Like they need him to be an impact player on that defensive line. That's why you draft him early in the 2nd round. And with his skill set, like there is a high upside there, the penetrator who can really, really, really be disruptive versus kind of like a more anchor defensive line type who's just super solid. So if he's a guy that develops into a star, then you've got one of your studs. You finally have a blue chip player on defense, which you haven't had in what feels like forever. Unless you want to count like Bobby coming in last year, you know, make 2nd team all pro. So it's pretty darn good. But like a true blue chip guy that you develop in-house. And so he's the first guy that honestly came to mind for me. I think Coleman's a great shout. Connerly, you know, is Sainer still already too far down his development path because he played so much and so well last year to still be, you know, considered in that role? Obviously Trey Amos. But I feel like what a lot of people are looking for here, Logan, is like, is there a current backup, a lower round pick who you think can develop into a starter? So now we're looking at the Madranos of the world or some of the guys who were drafted later last year, Dominique Hampton, et cetera.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Jordan is another great example. Like you mentioned, I'm glad you brought him up because he's perfect for this kind of developmental arc, right? And we were talking about doing a segment for the show where we kind of review old draft picks, and like the 33rd team did one with Check the Mic, and it was interesting to kind of see like how injury or other things sideline guys' production. So I think Johnny's a great guy because the injury last year is really going to augment his developmental pattern for sure. In terms of backup guys, I think the first guy that jumps to mind to the forefront of mind for me is a guy like there's a couple guys, and I'm gonna kind of list a couple off, and then we can talk about them. Jordan McGee, right?
Yeah. He's the first guy I was thinking of too, kind of in this realm.
He's interesting because again, like I thought he did well in training camp last year, and I don't want to like extrapolate too much off of training camp, but when you talk to guys on the staff about him, like their eyes light up, right? So there's something there in terms of energy. Obviously, when you watch his stuff from Temple, like he was really good at Temple. Like he's physical, he's athletic, he kind of checks all these boxes that you want for like a modern linebacker. Like when I think about modern linebacker, it's Fred Warner, right? It's this guy that can cover, can get downhill, can play sideline to sideline. And there were shades of that when he played at Temple. Now he has this injury, kind of like Johnny did last year, and his developmental role or his package or the methodology they were going to use to develop him was kind of sidelined because they had packages for him. They had situations they want to use them. They're not able to do that. And so like now this year, does that process get started? And does he kind of get to show that he's the, heir apparent to Bobby Wagner? Whenever Bobby chooses to walk away and leave this thing, like, is he the guy that's good enough to step in? So I think he's a really good example. Tyler Owens is one for me, more because of the athlete. And obviously, anytime you see someone who plays well on special teams, he's a guy that I'm like, can you find a larger role for that body type? He's 6'4", he's got 33-inch arms, he's fast. I think he like broke every like jump thing at the combine for his body weight. It was like something crazy, like a 12-foot broad jump or 11.8 broad jump, whatever it was. And, he had a crazy vertical. It was like 41 inches. Like his numbers were insane. And you see him on teams, like the way he flashes the physicality, the physicality of him. But can he get some minutes on defense, or is he just going to be a guy that's kind of a situational special teams guy for the rest of his career? Like those are the questions that I think are really interesting with a guy like Tyler Owens, Jordan McGee. And then I'm trying to remember anybody else on defense.
I mean, Hampton and Madrano would be the other two.
Hampton and Madrano to me are in a different tier, and obviously they're developmental, like no doubt about it. But like because of the position switch for Hampton, like I feel like he's got a longer way to go. Madrano, I think because he's a 5th round pick. It becomes interesting to think about like what his role is in the defense. Like this year, for example, like can he find a Jordan McGee kind of role for himself where he's the big nickel and he's playing a lot of minutes and he finds ways to get on the field, and you see a guy that has a trajectory that's going to be, impactful. Maybe not this year to that extent, but like shows hey, like if this guy gets more playing time, he's going to be a really, valuable addition to this defense. So those guys are interesting for sure. I just think it's a little bit farther away than Jordan because I think when you talk to the staff, like it's like right there for him. They want him to take that opportunity, and Tyler Owens too, like based on what he showed on teams last year. So if I had to tier those guys, I'd say there's like an A tier and a B tier, but I think they kind of fall into this bucket because, like with training camp, as you've watched a bunch of training camps, like sometimes, Dominique Hampton comes in and plays better than Jordan McGee. And then he's the guy that's got the package going into the season. And all of a sudden the developmental roles are a little bit different. But as of right now, which is, pretty early in the summer still, I'd say the first guys I mentioned are like kind of that A tier developmental guy. And then there's like a B tier developmental guy.
Madrano's 6th round pick, by the way.
6th round, I wasn't sure. 5th or 6th,
pick 205. I think I would almost say like there's like a tier above that I was talking about first with guys like Johnny, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like,
Jerzan, Johnny and Brandon, right? Yeah.
Jerzan, Brandon, Mikey, Jaden. Like Jaden, it feels crazy, but like he's still young. Like every young player is a developing player. And if you want to rank in terms of importance, like obviously there is no more important developmental player, if we have to come up with a list of 7, than Jaden Daniels. Jaden Daniels also played at a borderline MVP level last year. So like what does that, like, does he count? Does he qualify? But the better he gets, the farther this team is going to go.
Well, that's really interesting.
I would kind of take him out of it Like, because
that's what I'm saying is because he was so, because he's not developmental because you're relying on him so much. You know what I mean? Like, he's got to be good or you're terrible.
Like, he
it's
can still develop while also, but like, he doesn't have the leeway that the others do.
Correct.
But like, that's also part of the reason you took him second is because like, unlike which nobody told the Bears, but unlike Caleb Williams, who is 21 years old, and you're betting on the upside of what he can be. And that's why he was number one, because you're like, if we get this dude right, he could be one of the greatest we've ever seen. Like, that was the upside of Caleb. Jaden, obviously the upside was tremendously high, but he was also ready to go much quicker. Like, because Jaden was an older player, because he was more experienced, because of kind of who he is and the way he found success, he was a high floor, ready to go right now. We are going to be able to maximize. Like, Caleb Williams also might be really good when he's 23, 24 years old. It's not going to happen for another 2 seasons. Like, that's crazy. And so, your best years become a little cheaper if you're the team, but you may not have quite as long of a runway. Do you really care if your quarterback is only good for 10 to 12 years versus 12 to 15? Like, those are draft season questions we can answer next March. But I think, or hopefully never, and we'll see if we're still doing this podcast in 10 years when Jaden is done and we care about quarterback drafting again. But I think Jaden, I think I'm comfortable taking Jaden out. I think for Mikey, he's probably the second closest to being like graduating from this. They are relying upon him, but this is his first year playing the nickel as a pro. Like, he trained there last year, then played mostly outside. And I think kind of everyone else is on the table, even the second rounders, even Amos, even Newton. I think like those guys are in a different tier because there is a level of relying upon them, but they are starting and they're huge question marks in terms of just how good they're going to be. And they need to develop from like, they're probably okay now into star level players if you want to have an excellent top 5 type of defense. And then you have kind of the more traditional developmental model of like, we're hoping these late round picks that are starting on special teams can turn into solid starters for us. We don't necessarily need them to become stars. And if one does, like, that is legitimately found gold, in the same way that the 49ers had some found gold all over their roster, but especially a guy like Warner, who's a 3rd round pick who turns into the defining linebacker of the decade.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because it kind of reminds me of like The Athletic. They do that thing on their podcast where it's like there's a blue chip guy, which is like generational difference making. Then there's like red chip guys, and when you look at red chip guys, they're guys that like kind of make up the backbone of your roster, and like usually those guys are developmental pieces, right? And so, like, let's just take the offensive line as an example, because I mentioned Brandon Coleman and you mentioned Josh Connerly. Like, usually on the offensive line, you invest a certain amount of draft capital. Like, I think Philly is a good model for this, and so is Detroit, right? You find Lane Johnson in the 1st round. You get Landon Dickerson in the 2nd round. Like, you and the center, their new center who's taking over for Kelsey.
Cam Jurgens,
Yeah, he's a draft pick, right? Yeah. And then Tyler Steen's a 2nd round pick, right? But Tyler Steen has a developmental arc to him, right? You find Jordan Mailata late as a developmental prospect. So you look at this, you say, well, they traded for Laramie Tunsil, who's the guy, right? Brandon Coleman's moving to guard. He's a 3rd round pick. Like, he has to, for them to have a top 10 offensive line, like, he needs to develop, right? You feel good about Biotish, and you look at Cosme, what he's at, like these kind of cornerstone pieces in Tunsil, Biotish, and Cosme. And then you need Connerly to take steps, man. Like, I don't want to say right now, but in 2 years, he needs to be a serviceable starting right tackle. And I think, one of the things we talked about in his draft profile was like, he's good. Like, technically he's very good. Athletically, he's very good, but there's still a developmental arc to his career that needs to be actualized in order for him to be a good starting caliber player, be a red chip starting caliber offensive lineman. So I think that's kind of what I look at. And like, where I say, like, for this roster to go from where it's at to, again, like a top 10 roster, you need to hit on Trey Amos. Like, he needs to develop, like, he needs to actualize all that athletic potential. You need to hit on Johnny, right? I'm borderline taking Mike Sanderson out of here, like you talked about, but those 3 guys to me are kind of like those big chess pieces that really need to take big steps moving forward. I'm going to throw Brandon Coleman in there also. So 4 chess pieces that need to step forward. And we haven't even talked about Ben Sinnott and Luke McCaffrey in terms of draft pick. But in terms of like impactful, high value positions, corner, offensive line, defensive tackle, especially with the defensive tackle market the way it is at the moment, like, I think those are probably the 4 big ones. And then you kind of get into a debate about who's that tier 2 developmental prospect, who's the tier 3 developmental prospect, and why. But those, I know he wants 7, and we'll get to 7, but those 4 guys to me are really, really at the forefront.
Yeah, I mean, let's go ahead and try to get to 7, because let's take like, I don't know, 2, 3 from each tier. So like most important of the, like, let's pick 2, right? Of the top tier guys, we'll take Mikey out of it. We'll take Jaden out of it, right? So of the next group, Johnny, we'll keep in there. Coleman and Connerly. Is there one? Is there
like
one more?
Amos
and Amos, like,
yeah.
Those would be the 4. And then of the next group, I think McGee probably should make the list.
Yeah.
And then, and like, this is kind of it, right? Like, this is why also you try to take, and I know they didn't this year because they traded for Tunsil and they traded for Debo and they had fewer draft picks. But like, if you can have a bunch of picks and you can go 50% on 10 guys versus 50% on 5 guys, then you wind up finding the red chip guys. You find up, even below red chip, just like solid starters. Nevertheless, get more chances to get lucky on the blue chip. But if you can go 50% on that, I would say, man.
Well, I think Tyler Owens is interesting here too, because like you talked about, and you brought this up, like after Will Harris is out or, Quan Martin is out, like you're kind of like, who's the next guy? And so can he develop him and Percy Butler? I think Percy Butler is an interesting guy too. Like I like Percy.
Yeah.
We've talked about that along the show, but like, can you develop into a guy where you're not worried about mental mistakes? You're getting the right fits. Like you're not a liability. You're not like, clutching your pearls when that guy's in the game. And I think they're both physically capable of doing that, but for different reasons. Like they've kind of been these special team mavens, which is awesome. And you need those guys in your team. But if you can get them to take a step, right, just move from kind of that C range to that C plus B minus range, like that's a huge deal, and can you be an impactful person for the roster? And I think they can. I think they can. And like when you hear like the staff talk about those guys, there is some excitement, but there is like to get that added safety depth, like to get the depth at linebacker, like those people have to develop. And we talked about Jordan McGee, but Dominique Hampton's also a guy like you'd like to have at least 4 dudes there that you could feel like could play, right? So is that Kane or is that Dominique? And we'll see what happens. But I think that's why I have kind of identified that safety spot because of the way you've characterized it. And then obviously linebacker, same thing. Like what happens if Bobby's hurt? Like who's going to play?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is that's why I'd put Jordan above Kane and Dominique because like he is the Mike. Like he's the heir apparent to Bobby Wagner. There's one other guy. I think we've kind of pushed tight end down, which is something we're actually going to talk about a little bit later too. Like Sinnott was a second rounder. Like him hitting would be really nice, but at the end of the day, he's also a tight end, and there's a lot of really good tight ends coming out in the draft. If he winds up not, we're not giving up on him, but if he winds up not turning out, they take another guy this year. Like it's long term. I don't know how damaging that actually is. But I will say a guy that we haven't mentioned, and there are not a lot of 7th rounders, although I guess Owens is a UDFA, but like. If Bill hits, if Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt hits, to have a cheap running back for the next 3 years, like that's big time. Like that's a position you don't want to have to spend a ton of resources on, but you need to be really good. So I would say he's on my list probably. And then
I think Jean-Baptiste is another interesting one too.
That's a great call. That's a great call. If he can just become a solid, like they're gonna have to find their stud edge eventually. Probably you would think. But if like he can just be a really solid guy that plays next to Newton and like helps Newton become a star and is like a supporting role who's like, yeah, he's a legit pass rush threat, but he sets a great edge and he plays really well in stunts and twists to let Newton, be the guy who, gets a little bit more penetration. I think that's a great list. I think if you go the 4 guys we mentioned, McGee, Jean-Baptiste, and Bill, and that still, I mean, all those other guys we mentioned are still really important, but we got to draw a line at 7 somewhere.
Yeah, and I think the one that I was just talking about the defensive line, one that I think is kind of maybe borderline that first tier, and we haven't talked about him at all, is Kinlaw. Like if he develops and takes a step from...
That's interesting.
Yeah,
can a guy who just signed your most expensive free agent contract still be considered a developmental prospect?
And I think when you watch his film, he is, right? And I think that's the thing about him is like in the same way that you're excited about Connerly, I'm excited about Kinlaw. And what I mean by that is like I think the ceiling for Connerly is like a blue chip player, right? And I think the ceiling for Kinlaw is a blue chip player. Has he played that way? No. And I think when you watch the film, like you see, I've talked about the flashes a ton, right? But he's got to take a step, right? He's got to be more consistent. He's got to kind of go from the flash guy to the guy that is that red chip player. And I think you didn't pay him that way, like in terms of like dollars and cents compared to some of these other big defensive tackle contracts. But I think he can do that. And so if he's here with Dan Quinn, Tapp, and Kerrigan, and they can get him to take that step, like think about how devastating this defense would be when you had 3 dudes on the interior who can provide pass rush. And like when you look around the league and you see those teams with really solid interiors, like that's pretty dynamic. So he's a guy that I think, again, kind of is in that, that list of 4 for me, is if he can take that step alongside Johnny Newton. Like think about where this team could be, like in terms of defensive projection.
My only question is like, you're 27. Is this just who you are? You're going to be inconsistent.
It's a
even
great
if your
point.
highs are really high. And also when you're getting paid that much, even though it's not top of the market DT money, like you're still getting paid a pretty good amount. Can you still be considered developmental when it's like, no, we're kind of relying on you? Like to me, he's almost more in like the Jaden where it's like, nah, man, like you kind of need to play well. Otherwise we're up a creek.
I guess my question to you would be, and I don't think that's a bad point at all, would be like right now I could see him having some type of situational role, like, hey, you're in on first, second down, but you're really our third down pass rush defensive tackle or whatever, right? But what if you become like a dude? Like what if you fit? I mean,
this should be his prime.
Yeah.
So
so to me, that's where like that developmental arc for him is really interesting, because right now I there is a huge difference between him and Johnny, but I don't really, in my mind, when I watch the players on tape, see a huge difference, right? Like, does that make sense what I'm saying? Like,
it does. I think it's a great like discussion point. Like whether he ultimately, like, this is like, hey, you listen to the show because we have good, hopefully we try to have good, smart discussions that make you think a little bit about the game and the players and the things we're talking about. Not because of what the graphic looks like at the end. If we were to do like a Craig and Logan's top 7 guys, if we were to put Kinlaw in there, people would be like, the hell is he doing in there? He just signed like a monster contract. But so I think for the graphic, if Evan's going to make a graphic, let's leave him off the graphic and save the Instagram comments. But for those of you that have actually listened and paid attention to the show, like your point is very, very well taken, because there is a step for him. And if he can take it, oh my God, because Javon Kinlaw is one of the freakiest like athletes, which actually transitions nicely into our next question, but like one of the freakiest athletes we've seen in the NFL in a long time.
Yeah. So again, like, and I'm not sure. And you said Bill. I think that's another interesting one. Like, can you kind of fill that role? But yeah, those are the guys that to me kind of jump out. Obviously, Luke and Ben. Luke, I think, becomes more important from a developmental standpoint if Noah Brown's hurt, really dinged up, and like he's going to have to play a lot of minutes right now. So that'll be interesting to keep an eye on. But though those other ones seem like guys that are closer to taking that developmental step, and B, I think have the athletic upside to do it. I think that's why we kind of keyed in on those guys. Yeah.
It's hard to separate once you get past those like first and second round guys. Like who is, like, I could easily make an argument for Luke over all these guys that we spent more time on. But it's like kind of the ones that matter are the ones that hit. And then you just have to make up, because that's kind of how the draft works. The farther down the draft order you go, the quote unquote less important it is, because you can probably find a similar prospect next year. And if that guy hits, then you're fine. Also depends on the position and yada, yada. All right. I think people get it. Our audience is smart. Take Command Mailbag Edition. Craig Hoffman, Logan Paulson with you. This is a really fun one, Logan, from Silas. Or at least it's fun for me to read. We'll see how much fun it is for you to answer. Thanks for the work you and Logan do on the show. You're welcome, Silas. I had a question regarding the idea that Logan has brought up several times about athletic freaks in the NFL. What I'm curious about is what the minimum threshold of athleticism necessary is when combined with the right amount of work and dedication to be able to, quote unquote, make it at the next level. Asked a different way, among these incredibly gifted individuals, who are the worst athletes who have been able to successfully make it as pros? Along the same lines, I'm curious where Logan would rank himself on an athletic ability scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being Julio Jones or Myles Garrett. Thanks again for the great work, Silas.
That's a hell of a question. I don't know. There's like multiple questions in there. I don't even really know where to start. Like, should we start?
Wait, I think we should start with the fun at the end.
Okay.
Can you tell the story for longtime listeners? You've heard this one before, but the email from your tight ends coach.
So yeah, I had a tight ends coach who used to do like really comprehensive draft eval. So like he had like boxes basically. So he had like thresholds that he had calculated and determined. And basically, if you met the threshold, you were green. If you didn't meet the threshold, you were red. So like it was like arm length, 40, vertical jump, body weight, height, and there was something else. But it was like those 5 things, right? And basically, he went back and he's like, over the last, I think he went back 20 years. Like he's like, there's been this number of starting players at the tight end position, and he's like, only 2 of them have been reds, like across the board. Everyone else has been solidly green in all of these metrics. And so I was like, well, who are the 2 reds? And he goes like, you are one of them. And I was like, all right. So just to give you like an idea of like athleticism, right? Like I was probably, at least on paper, I didn't fall into this other tier of athlete, right? I was kind of a guy that got by clawing and scratching, like technical development, studying, all those different things to kind of give me that edge so that I could be a starting NFL tight end for a couple of years, and obviously I played for longer. And, he had an interesting point. He's like, when you're doing draft stuff, and so again, this kind of bleeds into talent evaluation. He's like, there's a couple things you're looking at. One is like the measurables, and that's really important. And then 2 is like mindset. Like, do they love ball? And I think that kind of gets to the crux of the question, right? Is I was about as bad as you could have been athletically and still play in the league. But like, according to this coach and all the other coaches that I've played with, like I was at the combine this year and a coach bumped into me. He's like, dude, like if you had smoked a cigarette, if you had to drink alcohol, if you had not counted your calories or whatever, like you would have been out of the league in 2 years. Right. And I think there's something to that. And so like, I take a lot of pride in the fact that like I was able to like squeeze every ounce of whatever I had out of it. But it speaks, and I'm not telling that to like toot my horn, like it speaks to like this idea that you have good athletes, but you have a mindset associated to that. Like a guy that's going to improve and going to get better and going to grind and going to make it happen, and I think like that's something that is interesting to talk about. It's interesting to talk about, like with free agencies, like how free agency additions, draft additions, like, are they going to develop? Are they going to stick around? And I think that's a big element that we have a hard time dealing with and talking about because we don't get to know the players, right? But I think that, I don't know if that definitely answers.
No, it directly answers the question. Like it both answers like the where does Logan rank and the sorry to word this harshly, I'm just rereading the question. Among these incredibly gifted athletes, which does acknowledge that like to make it in the league compared to the general population, you have to be incredibly gifted. But amongst these incredibly gifted athletes, who are the worst athletes who've been able to successfully make it as pros?
I'm
Logan.
pretty close.
Yeah.
I'm pretty close. Like,
on the tight end front. Yeah.
Which is crazy to think
so,
about.
like, real quick to like contextualize this. What were like at your best in the NFL? Like height, weight, speed. Like what are you measuring? That way some bloke listening, I don't know why I just use bloke because I'm not English. Some bloke listening goes out and runs a 40 and realizes how fast you are compared to them.
Right. So I was probably at my tallest. I've shrunk since I played. I was probably about 6'5". I was, my arms were about 32 inches. I ran a 4.8 940 and I weighed 268 pounds when I did it. I bench pressed, I want to say 225, 26 times. And I had like a close to 30-inch vertical when I jumped. So like, obviously not very explosive. But you know, what's crazy is when I tell people that they go, oh, that's like not crazy, but also like, to give you some context, because like no one's run a 40, no one does 225 for reps anymore, really. So in high school, like I was a 3-sport athlete. Like I played soccer on varsity for 4 years. I played varsity football for 3 years. I ran varsity track for 4 years. I used to be able to run like, a sub, like right around a 400 meter split, you know what
That's
I mean?
crazy.
Which is crazy. Right. And so
that's so fast.
I used to be able to run a 2 mile. This is my big claim to fame, 2 miles in 10 minutes and 15 seconds when I was training for soccer. So like people think like, oh, like I could go out and be an NFL. Like I got another funny story. So like to give it context on the athleticism, like I just said I was the worst athlete probably on the Washington Commanders or Washington Redskins when I was a rookie. And I had a roommate and he was like, hey, why don't you come play flag football with us one day? And I was like, sure. And I felt like I was Julio Jones. Like I was making like mossing people.
So you're playing against like your roommate was not a football player.
No, he was just like a guy. Right. And so I went out there and like, I probably had like 3 or 4 touchdowns. I had interception. Like, you know what I mean? Like, a guy came up to me and said like, you coming out here has forever changed my perspective on what it means to be in the NFL.
100%.
Because I saw you last year as a rookie and I thought that guy is a scrub. And then you come out here and you're miles by far the best player out here. And I think that's where the balance comes in. And like, he didn't have to say that to me. He was, but like, I came out and I just did an awesome job. Like, so I think that's where it's like, people think about like, I'm here. Like, who's that basketball player? The big
Brian
white
Scalabrine.
dude?
Yeah.
Like where he's like, I'm way closer to LeBron James than you are to me. I think there is a little bit of truth to that. When you're actually like in it, you realize like, man, like there are levels to this thing. And like, to be in this group of like 2,000 players that play in the NFL, you have to be a decent athlete at some level. But like, people don't understand like what I don't know. I've said this to you before. I don't think people can even fathom like what the pinnacle of that looks like what seeing a Julio Jones looks like, what seeing a Trent Williams looks like what seeing a Myles Garrett looks like. It's just it's almost a different species of human being. You know what I mean? And I think like it's so hard for people to understand, because until they see someone like me, they have no context on like how high it is to the top of the mountain.
You look at Myles Garrett and you're like, that's crazy. But you're closer to Myles Garrett than like the other dudes that you were mossing on that football field. Funny, like related story. So my first 2 years of school, I went to Middle Tennessee State before I transferred to Syracuse. And so I got to know the basketball team pretty well. I was doing a lot of basketball stuff, and I played pickup with them one time because they were just playing at the rec center, like the student rec center. And there's this kid, Zane. Shout out to Zane if somehow he ever finds this clip. But he was like the literal walk-on white guy at the end of the bench of Middle Tennessee State University.
Was amazing.
So like mid-major school. And that's who I got put on. And Zane, absolutely, like the speed at which he was able to catch and shoot, run around screens. Like if I touched the ball, I felt like I was being tackled, even though they were just playing like pickup level defense. Like the speed and intensity of that compared to, and like if those dudes went on an NBA court, like that's what they would feel like. Like it's just the levels are crazy. And there's also a very like very funny, unrelated to my basketball story, but related to the topic, very funny video going around the internet this past week of Kyle Juszczyk working out with his wife. And like the first video, I think I sent it to you, is like Kyle doing a medicine ball throw, and he like granny tosses it over his head like 30 yards. Like that thing flies. And then Kristen, his wife, grabs it, and she can like barely get it over her shoulder. And like, again, like it's like, oh, well, she's the girl. And it's like, yeah, but he threw it 30 yards, bro. Like it is insane. There's some great YouTube stuff. Myles Garrett did a workout with like a YouTube influencer type, and Garrett does like a medicine ball thing, and he almost throws the ball on the roof of a building that's 40 feet high. And this other dude like gets it 6 feet over his head. Like, it is hard to describe how physically freakish NFL players are, but there's just a couple of examples, and you told some great stories too of the separation here.
Well, dude, like I remember like doing med ball throws, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And being like me with the other tight ends, and like Fred Davis, like, and again, he's like, people don't think of him as being this tremendous athlete, but he would absolutely eject that thing. Like, he'd be standing about 40 feet away, and I could barely get it to him. You know what I mean? Like it's 20-pound med ball, like it was a good throw. And he would just launch that thing like 50 feet, 60 feet. And I was like, dude, this is like a different, like he would do incline dumbbell bench press with like 140, for sets of 8. And I just was, and it's just like, it's so hard to contextualize the level of strength, the level of physical violence, like the level of, and that's the other thing, like I always make this comparison to like horses or dogs, like anybody who's like into, like there's like, you ever been around like a working dog? Like a retriever of some kind, and you throw a ball for them, and they will literally chase that ball until they die. Like there is a little bit of that going on with these NFL guys. Like they are just so geared up mentally, like in competitive situations. Like you've kind of created this crazy pool of natural selection. NBA too, I'm sure it's like this, where it's like they just want to play and want to compete, and they want to be the best. And that's that mental element that you're always chasing. And like that's where, like Julio Jones is a great example of this, because he asked about Julio Jones, is like he wanted to be the best. Like he not only was he a freak, but he wanted to be the best. Like if someone did something at practice, he was like, I'm going to do that. I'm going to be better. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like George Kittle, same type of deal. Like just wired in this, like this primal instinct to be like, I am better than you. I know it. And like when you combine that with the athlete, that's when you get this kind of the guy that's riding into battle, this barbarian that just wants to win. Like that's what those dudes are. Like they're the definition of like alpha male, I think, is thrown around way too liberally, because like I've seen what it looks like. Like Trent Williams, like he's not that crazy competitor, but like my God, like when he's on the field, like something happens to him. You know what I mean? And it's a different. Not only is it a different physicality, it's a different mentality as well.
For sure. So if like Julio and Myles Garrett are 10 and Logan's 1 on the NFL scale, like most of us are at -85. So there's the perspective there. But I think that it's worth mentioning within the context of the league. You take us regular peons out of it and like try to stop saying like, okay, NFL players are way different than, like I, as someone who works out a lot and people are like, oh, you're still fit. Like I am so far away from the threshold of an NFL athlete. Right. But within the NFL, I think it's worth saying like the difference between like a 4.4 and a 4.6 receiver, and like why can the 4.6 receiver make it when you're not a 4.4? And I think that's where you get to not just mentality, but like the other part that you have not mentioned that I will compliment you on of why you were able to be successful is like your football IQ is so high that you were able to anticipate. And so if we're literally talking about 0.2 of a second over the course of 40 yards, and if you watch like the phantom cams or whatever they call that thing that, Rich Eisen's being slow behind, but they also compare like players with it on the 40, right? And you see like, oh, there's actually like 3-4 yards of separation between a 4.6 and 4.4 guy on the 40 at the combine. So like there's it's 0.2 of a second, but there's like real space there. How do you make that space up? And if you can anticipate and make up your 0.2 by understanding what's going to happen before the 4.4 guy, well, that's going to help you play at the speed you need to succeed in the NFL. Where the better athlete is helpful is like, one, if you have the athleticism and the anticipation, you get to be Jamar Chase, right? That's how like, oh, you're just so far ahead of everyone else. But even if you're a 4.4 guy who sees it a little slow, you have time because your athleticism can make up for your lack of reaction time, your lack of understanding. Whereas like you had a supercomputer up here and you were able to anticipate, and even though you weren't as fast as the guy who might also be playing your position, you'd get there at the same time when you need to because you started faster. And like that's why, like, is there a minimum threshold? Yes. How do you overcome it? You know what the hell you're doing at such a high level that it matters less.
Yeah, I think that's for sure. And also like there was this kind of like guys like you were talking about with receivers specifically, guys that have like this compulsion to like learn the techniques, right? Like, like you mentioned the 4.4 guy, like one of the reasons I think you always want to try to find a faster guy that plays a skill position is it takes them 3 years to learn the coverages, 3 years to learn the techniques. And by the time they've lost that 10th, technically you don't see any difference between the players because they've got the technical acumen now to support the loss of athleticism or raw explosiveness, right? And so I think that was the other thing that looking at my career was like I was able to like learn the techniques really well, like hand placement, like why this is important, foot position, why that's important. And I was willing to rep it a lot, I say this when I do this like tight end seminar out in California for my agent. And like I'd get out to practice 15 minutes early and just work footwork. I'd stay 20 minutes after to work footwork. And that's not even including film preparation, body maintenance, things like that. And so like there is a compulsive element that some of these people have, like to run a route, to work a technique from a pass protection standpoint, to understand my angle and my line and just never get bored doing the basic, simple stuff. And so I think that's where, again, like they're all great athletes. Like even, like we mentioned Tyler Owens, like he's a freak, right? But he's like a special teams backup because of he lacks some of that like football intuition right now. Can you learn it? Yeah. Right. Can you develop in that category? For sure, 100%. I think that's where special, like the starting players are special because they are usually some combination of that, right? They're a combination of like Terry's a great example. Like Terry kind of he's not only he's a great linear athlete, but there's like kind of an awkwardness to how he tracks and catches the football, but he's developed systems and methodologies to overcome whatever that deficiency is because he's compulsive about it, right? He's dogmatic about it and he's hyper competitive. And I think like that's where you get kind of that sweet spot of like NFL starter and again, there are guys that, and I'll say this, there are guys that don't have that compulsion, but they're usually out of league pretty quick because the second the speed goes, the second the agility goes, the second the size or the physicality goes, there's no methodology to overcome it. So yeah, I think that's a really good point by you. Just like there are techniques, a technical understanding that are, and a knowledge of the game that is so important that helps guys kind of survive on lesser athleticism.
Yeah, and last small point too. Just we could talk about this forever because you and I are nerds about this stuff. But just there's a lot more to athleticism than like how fast you run. Like how fast you decelerate is almost more important than how fast you accelerate. Especially if you're depending on your position. If you're a receiver, your ability to stop on a dime. Sure, you're not going quite as fast, but like I can stop and that corner is still going. Well, now I have separation, the ability to get in and out of cuts. Like there is a lot more than like linear acceleration and top speed. That doesn't get measured at the combine, or you have to kind of know what you're looking for to find it within the 3-cone numbers or whatever that measures athleticism too. So what we consider an athletic, like nobody considers Nikola Jokic an athletic freak, but he is. Luka Doncic, like his ability to stop, decelerate, reshift his weight, like get on balance. Like balance is such an important part of athleticism, and we don't measure that because how would you? Like those are the kinds of things that I think also really matter too, that aren't going to show up on your traditional combine testing.
Yeah. So that's, and like just to piggyback on that real quick, like it's like that's where like defining athleticism, it's so easy to be like, oh, height, weight, speed, jump, whatever. Yeah. But like it's much more layered, much more nuanced. Like there's like a reactive element to it also, you know what I mean, that I think we haven't really touched on, but it's more layered. Like I think a great example of this, a simple example is like DBs, for example. Like they all are great movers, right? But some of the best athletes I've ever seen have been really bad at playing DB because they lack that kind of fluidity to track a football in the air or adjust to a receiver or make some of those things. And that's not going to show up in like a jump metric, right? But it's athletic. It's like the same way that a ballerina is athletic. Like there's some of that kind of fluidity here too that I think is really underrated in this athletic conversation generally, which, like it comes up with some of those things we talked about with like Luka and other kind of non-athlete athletes,
Right. Hope that answered your question, Silas. Wrapping up here on Take Command, Logan Paulson there, Craig Hoffman here. We got a double question to end, Logan, two kind of related questions. Rod had a question about like, why don't we see the Cal Stanford band play more often and like teams trying to do that and offensive linemen handling the ball. So we'll put that as like a precursor. I'm not going to read Rod's whole question, but Rod, shout out. Thanks. You sent in a couple great questions. But that will probably bend into this answer from Andy, who says, hello, all the way from Scotland, which of course, this is a great way to get in because I got married in Scotland. So if you're, if you're from Scotland, good chance we're going to answer your question. Now that it's silly season, here's a question that's always bugged me. Why aren't there more design lateral passes in the NFL? I've watched for 30 years, and the amount of times a simple lateral pass was on before a guy gets tackled is crazy. It was rugby union coaches who created the tush push, but there's another version called rugby league. It's a more structured version of the game with more lateral passing, and I think if a team brought in some rugby league coaches to teach lateral passing and ball security, it could be revolutionary. Love the show. Can't wait for what next season brings for Washington. Thanks, Andy. Logan, you've done a lot of rugby work in the past couple of years, learning about the game more. What do you think about more laterals in American football?
Yeah, so I've got I coach high school football, and I've thought about that. I'm like, man, I want to incorporate more of this. So a couple things. One, like the ability to block in football is a lower risk way to get around this like lateral element, because basically you're trying to get to a 2-on-1, right? Like it's like me and Craig are running down the field. There's a defender here. He's going to tackle me. I'm going to pitch it off to my right? If I'm running with Craig and I don't have the ball, why don't I just block this guy? And then Craig can keep running. You know what I'm saying? And that's
and now we don't have to pitch it. We don't have to have a throw and a catch that both have to be executed. It's a lower risk.
Yeah. And so again, like that's one of the huge, like the major differences between rugby and, football is that you can't block in rugby. And so like having that element of blocking is extremely important to football. I mean, it's like one of the defining features of the game, like no other sport, I don't think, like, can you block the way you can in football, right? So like that's where, like in order to mitigate risk of a lateral, like, I was the other day, I was talking to my offensive line coach, who's kind of like, we're kind of like we're developing an offense for a new high school that I'm working at. And one of the things that came up was like, can we do this lateral thing? And ultimately, like what I come back to is like, it's too risky. You know what I mean? I'm going to have to teach some kid in high school how to catch and pitch, don't drop the ball. And then can I get the pitch to this other guy who also cannot drop the ball? And because if you lose the football, again, like it's the same thing in rugby, it's a change of possession. And so in rugby, that's a skill that you develop since like kind of like in soccer, like you learn how to kick with your feet since like you're 3 years old. In rugby, you learn how to pass and catch in the way that they pass and catch since they're 3 years old. So it's a skill that is not, the quarterbacks can do it because they do all the triple option pitch stuff and they have that skill set developed. But for everybody else, it's an underdeveloped skill for sure. Now, the other element that I looked into with regards to this pitch thing, because again, it was something that I wanted to implement. I thought, man, this is great value, is in rugby, they let you get away. So like if I'm standing on the 50-yard line, I can pass it in rugby right down the 50-yard line, right? And that's okay. In football, that's like a forward pass. It has to have a negative degree. It has to be truly behind you, right? So you lose some of the advantage of that, of what you get in rugby, where it's like, hey, this guy's running with me. I can pitch it out right down, right straight out for me, right across this line, and he can run onto it and go. I have to pitch it behind me. And again, that makes it a little bit more challenging because that's a relationship you have to work on a lot more acutely in football, right? Because if the guy gets a little bit ahead of where he's supposed to be, it's going to be a forward pass. It's going to be a penalty. So I think those two elements, three elements, the blocking, the time on task, and then the actual rules of what a lateral is in football actually has to be behind you. So if it's not behind you, then it's a penalty. And I think that's where you lose some of the, each one of those things makes it more and more risky. And as you know, we've talked about on the show, football coaches are crazy risk averse. Yeah. So, obviously I wanted to do it. And then the more I looked into it, the more I was like, actually, this is a big pain in the butt. I'm not going to do it now.
So allow me to be the chaos agent. That's my role on the show. I feel like a lot of the stuff you're talking about is structured, where it's like, let's do a hook and lateral. Let's throw the ball to this guy, have another guy coming across, whatever. What if we just freed our dudes up to lateral the ball in space, right? So you're running, you're about to get tackled, or even you're running and you see another guy.
This is a great question. This is a great question because it calls it into very clear focus a difference between those two sports. But go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm running, diagonal, and then instead of blocking, my teammate is just going to be like, fake block. Now I'm going to come behind you. I pitch it to him the other way, or he's running and I'm like, yo, here. Right, they're more free form, a little more basketball to it. And now, obviously, right. I can't hit a guy on a backdoor pass, but can I have that playmaking ability to read the game as it's happening? Or if I'm getting stopped up and I'm about to I'm getting wrapped up, but my arm is free and I see a guy that's coming up, can I just pitch him the ball? Now these guys are coming at me and trying to stop me, pile me up, and he's got a running start around them the other way. What if we just freed our guys up to lateral the ball Travis Kelce style, freestyle willy-nilly versus trying to do this stuff by design?
Yeah. So again, Travis Kelce is a good example because he's a quarterback. He's a former quarterback. And say what you want about quarterbacks, they do handle the football a lot. So they understand this element of the game at a very high level. And so if you had a bunch of quarterbacks that are used to handling the ball, used to doing some of this kind of pitching and handling the ball, and because again, you're always taught high and tight, this is not a good pitch position, 5
right.
points of contact. This is rugby players hold the ball out in front so they can dish it right. either way, right? So obviously that's something that hasn't been coached as a fundamental of the game since the beginning of time for football, right? The other element of this is interesting too, and I've kicked it around, is in rugby, it's pretty two-dimensional. It's there's a line in between the offense and the defense, right? And so when I pass it to my right, the guy that's going to tackle me is coming straight downhill. It's not a 3D.
There's
tackle.
No chasing defensive linemen, etc.
Correct. Because you'll be offsides, right? So obviously there's times where people bake through and you've got a support player and you pitch it off. I think that's kind of what you're describing with the Travis Kelce setup. And I'm okay with that. Right. But I think the other element too is when I'm in the field, now it is a 3D tackle. There's defensive linemen who are coming out of the stack. There's linebackers who are pursuing. There's safeties are pursuing. So now I don't have to, now as the ball pitcher, I have to be aware of every direction as opposed to what's right in front of me. Right. And the relationship of that player to the person that's covering the pitch man. And I think that's another element of football to rugby, this basketball thing that you're describing, that becomes really complicated to deal with, right? Because it's you're asking that person to digest so much information, and again, it's just a structural difference in the game between football and rugby. And again, there are elements you'll see. I think triple option. If what's the guy's name? Andy, was that his name?
Yeah.
Andy, if you want to see like versions of rugby, like watch Triple Option. Essentially, it's all designed to get this kind of rugby style setup, right? But it's all done from a stationary, like set hut. I fake the dive. Someone's running downhill. Think about it. Like if I'm going to pitch, I'm going to have that action downhill, right, in rugby. And then I'm going to work around. Then I'm going to have a guy so I can get that 2-on-1. That's essentially what triple option football is. It's just digested and fit into football, right? Where we've kept it a 2D space, right? Because it's at the line of scrimmage. When you get downfield, I think it gets a little bit too confusing and too complicated. There's too many variables for the guys to deal with. But again, there are guys like Travis Kelce who do a great job of finding those moments for those pitches. But I also think like he's got a lot of flexibility to make mistakes in that system there in Kansas City that a lot of other people don't have. So
yeah, well, you're a future Hall of Famer. You get away with some stuff. Also, I think like there's a temptation to be like, come on, let them be athletes. But like, go watch football. Going back to our last conversation, go watch football players play basketball. Actually, don't let them be athletes. You, sir, you just take that ball and you run. And when they tackle you, you get up and we'll get you the ball again in the next play. Because the decision-making in space and the spatial awareness versus just like, hey, man, run straight or make that guy miss or run him over.
Right.
Like very, very different. Be an athlete than Travis Kelce, who, by the way, on top of being a quarterback, was a pretty high-level basketball player. And like, if it was up to him, he would have gone pro in basketball, but he was too good at football and not good enough at basketball. But like that spatial awareness that he has for playing a different sport makes it so that he is more successful than if we just let everybody do it.
And that's a great point. Like my son's playing rugby right now, right? And so he's like a hockey player. But when you get a football player over to the rugby space, they are bad at those decisions. Like they're terrible. Yeah. Like they're great. Like if you say, hey man, you're super fast, go like beat this guy vertically. It's there was a guy who played for the American Sevens team. He was a former football player, but basically same type of thing. He was like a bad rugby player, but he was so fast and explosive he could make people miss. He became a good sevens player, right? And so it's like it's something that's not cultivated in our game. And like, so I will say this too, turning the football over in football, I think is way more significant than it is in rugby, right? Like a fumble is devastating. Like an interception is devastating, right? So, and I think you'll remember in the playoff game, Travis Kelce did that lateral thing and it worked. And Andy Reid came over and ripped him a new one because the likelihood of them dropping that is very, very high still, right? And so I think that's like it's just such a huge penalty for any type of mistake. And again, like if you have a suggestion on how to get it implemented into football, I'm all about it because I want to find a way to do it. But I just think there's too many negatives the more I think about it that make it hard to implement it. And again, like we don't over here in the United States, like we don't coach that. We don't coach the catch pitch element. And again, like you see it, my son's 11, so he's playing 12U rugby. So he has guys that are 9 and guys that are 13 on the team. Like it's not a natural thing in sports here. And they really have to work on it a lot. The coaches do to kind of get it out of the football mentality and into a rugby mentality.
No doubt. All right. Those are the answers to the questions. We have more questions already in the hopper next week. But if you would like to add yours to our list, you can send us an email, hoffmanshow.com, use the contact link, or you can go on Instagram and hit me at hoffman.sports or Logan at Logan_Paulson82. Thanks so much for listening this week. We'll be back with our coach rankings on Thursday. Be well, everyone. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Take Command.